afternoon, everyone. I believe it is afternoon. I'm Susan Ostermann, Kellogg Fellow, faculty member in the Keough School, as well as in the Political Science Department at Notre Dame. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for this panel on the bureaucracy, how public officials resist backsliding. So we have Katherine, Kate, Bersch, Associate Professor of Political Science at Davidson College. We have Alexandre Gomide, Director for Advanced Studies at the National School of Public Administration in Brazil. We have Russell Muirhead, Professor of Democracy and Politics and co-director of the Political Economy Project at Dartmouth College. And finally, last but not least, we have Zsuzsanna Szelényi, Director of the Democracy Institute Leadership Academy at the Central European University in Hungary. Now, to lead us off, I'll just say that the importance of our topic today, I believe, cannot be overstated. And I'm not just saying that because as a scholar of regulatory compliance and state capacity, I'm often amazed by the fact that the bureaucracy is overlooked despite its vital importance. I'm saying that because the bureaucracy is, as recognized at great length by Max Weber, central to the functioning of the state. So bureaucratic capacity is state capacity. And when it is working well, it is nearly invisible. As I told my global politics and policy students in January of this year, as I was trying to explain what was happening at USAID, I said, when bureaucracy works well, you think you don't need it. Interestingly, as we are witnessing daily here in the United States, the bureaucracy, which is technically at the executive's disposal, is simultaneously the instrument of change and the object of it. The bureaucracy is also a key site for resistance during democratic backsliding. During the first Trump administration, and note the use of the word administration there, I was in regular touch with friends at the US State Department and marveled that they somehow continued in their jobs despite being underpaid and subject to really quite unfair attacks from the executive and the media. Yet they continued because, as many told me, doing their jobs as professionals and in compliance with law was the most impactful thing that they could do. And yet, because the bureaucracy is so hard to see when it is functioning well, it was only in exceptional cases that we glimpsed their resistance. This makes studying it that much harder. Once an autocratic executive has fully transformed the bureaucracy, it is just an instrument. We know that this has happened when the bureaucracy is used to undercut legal norms, including constitutional ones. Last week, I was in India as regional tensions almost spiraled out of control. As a scholar who has done work in both India and Pakistan, and as friends in both places, I received a constant barrage of emails and text messages from well-educated and well-connected people on both sides of the border who were struggling to find decent, actionable information. Amidst this, one particular bureaucratic action stood out. It was a Ministry of Information and Broadcasting directive in India in the form of a compliance reminder. And it stated that creators must, quote unquote, ensure that no content is anti-India, anti-national, pro-Pakistan, or supportive of Pakistan-related propaganda in any form. This is, of course, in direct violation of India's constitutional level protections for speech. And when the courts have a moment to catch up, they will likely right this wrong. But to me, it has already served its purpose. It was an important piece of data on how little bureaucratic resistance remains in India. It also reminded me just how important our topic for today is for the future of democracy globally. With that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to our panelists, who will each have 12 minutes to present before we open the discussion up to questions for the remaining 20 minutes. Kate.
Okay, thank you very much to Kellogg, to the organizers of this important conference, and to Susan for this great setup. So we were asked 3 questions about bureaucracy, and I want to start with the first because I think it really gets at the stakes although it's perhaps more clear to see what the stakes are today and after the great setup of the civil service panel this morning. So the first question asked was, how do executives use a captured bureaucracy to undermine democracy? Modern states, when I was asked this, I was thinking modern states are complex, and I immediately started thinking about the vast organizational chart of both Brazil and the US, the two countries that I know perhaps best. But each of these ministries, agencies, departments, many of them can be used in ways that undermine democracy. There are a variety of ways in which they can reward loyalists, punish dissenters, control information, the media. They are subject to weakening other branches. Talk more about that a little bit later. Controlling the state also means that you can control what is known as the regulatory process. And this allows an executive that has overreached and has controlled the process to change policy within the state itself. And of course, the regulatory process and the way in which it's deployed can reward business allies, punish foes. The state also includes, of course, the security apparatus, the deployment of police and the military to intimidate opposition. And the list gets scarier and scarier and goes on and on. Even when backsliding is halted, efforts to control the state can weaken state capacity and effects can be enduring for the long haul. So the question is, and the question I want to focus my attention today on is, how do they develop control? As I said, the state is very complex. And as I tried to get this into a 12-minute talk, I realized the reason it's really hard to get it into a 12-minute talk is that it's not necessarily that well understood. We're taught in civics classes and whatnot about the separation of powers. We know how that works. And we know that the executive is head of the executive branch. But where does that leave independent agencies? Where does that leave the civil service? Where does that leave the protections for the regulatory process? All of this, at least in the US, has been developed over a long course of time. And it's something that not that many American citizens are familiar with. And I will confess, until I was given an assignment to understand the regulatory process and control of the regulatory process, I myself didn't understand that much about the power of the APA or notice and comment or regulation. But I'm going to make the argument that in today's world, not only in the US, but in Brazil and across countries, to understand democratic backsliding, we need to open up the state and understand the rules of the game within the state. Doing so allows us to separate what is executive overreach or democratic backsliding from a couple of related things. Of course, when a president is elected, he or she comes in with a political mandate to make change. That, of course, includes policy change. And so separating what are policy changes from executive overreach is a central challenge. We cannot understand that if we don't understand those rules of the game. But second, there is, of course, a need for common sense reforms. There are many reforms that I think I and my colleagues who are part of the Reform for Results group would argue that the US needs. And so differentiating what is reform from executive overreach that tips into democratic backsliding, that is the challenge. So I'm going to talk today about some ways they develop control, and I'm going to talk about the formal aspects of this and some of the informal, and then with whatever time I have left of the 12 minutes, I'll talk about resistance strategies and then leave it to my colleagues for the rest of this important topic. So formal and informal ways of capturing the bureaucracy. So in my work, I highlight, and some of this work is done with Frank Fukuyama and Cameron Eunice. In my work, I highlight two very important constraints that I think we can think of as dimensions that govern control of the executive branch. The first is probably the one that most of you are thinking of, which is personnel, appointment and removal power, the ability to appoint or remove political appointees versus having civil servants that remain tenured. So to just give you a sense of the cross-national variation we see here, in Denmark, about 24 political appointees turn over with a turnover of government. In the US, traditionally, that's been 4,000. In Brazil, that's 25,000. Varies dramatically, and we'll get back to this in one moment. This second type of constraint within the executive branch that is maybe not as well known or thought about as carefully are the legal or procedural constraints. Civil servants don't just follow the directive of a president or make up the policies that they implement. They are required to follow the statutes that are passed by Congress. They are required to follow the procedures that are passed in those statutes by Congress, as well as all of the constitutional and other court-mandated orders in terms of how they conduct their business. This is often what is known as the very dry administrative law, right? But aspects of this are super important. I'm going to give today just one example that I think is perhaps the most important example for the moment that many countries, but I think especially the United States, find themselves in. Regulations. We throw the word around a lot. What is this? This is a rule with the force of law, functionally indistinguishable from legislation passed by Congress. One might argue, having unelected bureaucrats pass rules with the force of law seems somewhat democratic. In 1946, the Congress felt somewhat the same way and said, actually, following the FDR, all of the changes, maybe we need some constraints on how this operates. The Constitution gives us very little in the way of constraints around the executive. So here comes the APA in 1946, which is considered somewhat semi-constitutional. Why is that? This implements what's known as, stick with me for a moment, it gets a little dry, but the notice and comment process. Sounds terribly boring, doesn't it? But the notice and comment process requires that any proposed rule must be posted in the Federal Register. There's a moment for comments, and then the individuals in that agency must address comments in their final promulgated rule. What does this do? This seeks to inject a bit of, there are critiques of the process, but injects some democratic accountability into the process. But importantly, for an executive that wants to transform procedures and wants to transform them very quickly, having to do this process to rescind rules is complex, time-consuming, and requires considerable expertise and understanding of the process. This was a very big challenge for Trump 1. And so it perhaps is not a surprise that this is in the crosshairs of the current administration. So those are just two examples, but understanding how procedures and personnel can be thought of together, my colleagues and I are mapping different agencies within states to understand what are the constraints on executive authority there. Are we dealing with deliberative bureaucracies? Are we dealing with a deep state? Or have those constraints changed so much that we are moving into the territory of a unilateral executive that is not held accountable by personnel or by procedures? One important example of what I think these rule changes can look like is a current proposed rule that is currently out for notice and comment. When I checked last night, it had about 6,000 comments. But this is a rule that would move 50,000 civil servants into fireable positions. That is a dramatic change from the 4,000 civil servants we have currently. Brazil, by the way, 25,000. So these are the types of big shifts that one would want to watch out for. Now, what's the difference between that and reform? Because I think there are many reforms that are needed in the public bureaucracy. The difference between that and a reform is the bipartisan nature that it might engender, or for many of the other changes, going to the rightful authority, who is Congress. Okay. I spent a lot of time telling you about the formal rules. Quickly, some of the informal rules. Even if you don't mess around with any of the formal rules, there's so much that can be done with creative legal work, with speed, with intimidation. My co-authors, Gabriela and Lotte, and I have written about this process in Brazil. There are many ways to transfer people or to put them in freezing buildings or freeze them. So we could go on with the very creative strategies that have been used to control bureaucracies. How then do we resist? Okay, I'm going to talk about briefly internal and external strategies in this regard. So much of this work comes from both interviews here in the US at the EPA and also in Brazil in their environmental agencies. But one key that we have seen over and over again is the ability to collectively organize prior to the attack proves decisive in one's ability to react. I always remember looking at this Brazilian document of workers in the environment, mess with one, mess with all. And so oftentimes using ways to band together prior to the attacks is very helpful. Another argument would be don't contest every decision, contest the most important. Why? There's a lot of things that presidents might direct you to do that are democratically legitimate. Knowing when and why, and this requires knowing the law, which civil servants are very good at, knowing the law well and knowing when you're being asked to do something that is against a statute, that is unconstitutional, using that as a backing and contesting those is a great strategy as well. There's many external supports, and many of you might be thinking, what about the courts? What about Congress? Absolutely. The bureaucracy cannot resist forever without the support of Congress and the courts. And this is where I think Congress, in many places, can be very helpful in pushing back against these things. When it's not, one's left with the courts, which is a very slow process, especially when you have a determined executive that can move very quickly. Oftentimes, the damage is done before people can resist. But I know I'm almost out of time, I'll give just two examples of other successful resistance. It doesn't rely on Congress or courts. So it's been very interesting to watch in Brazil under Bolsonaro, the health and the environmental ministries. A lot of us thought the environmental ministries would be able to stand up against the pressures of Bolsonaro to dismantle what many considered statutory requirements to protect the Amazon and protect the forest. However, in the face of a very determined executive and without external support, they really were weakened over time. By contrast, many of the health agencies, what we saw is that governments at the state level banded together along with the private sector and a lot of other organizations as well. Even in the face of a determined executive who took the very, very similar approach in the health agencies, my colleagues such as Jessica Rich and Natalia Conga have written about how they were, health agencies, incredibly resilient in the face of attacks on their statutory authority. So much more I would like to say, but I believe I'm out of time, and I'm going to leave it for the rest of my colleagues to tell us more about this very important topic.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be part of this panel, and thank you for the invitation. And I need to recognize that it's not this topic about bureaucracy. It's not have so much sex appeal because nobody likes bureaucracy. So we're going to talk about this topic in a very neutral way. But as Kate said, it's a very important topic, especially if you think that state administration is important for delivering goods, services, and especially fundamental rights, because you need bureaucracy to deliver all of those things. And I'll speak about the case of Brazil during the Bolsonaro's administration between 2019 and 2022. And I organized my talk around the questions that Susan shared with us in advance. So I'm trying to answer these 4 questions that she sent us. So the first one is how do executives encroach on public services? As Kate mentioned, politicizing leadership is one way, but as she told us, Brazil has a lot of free appointments, 25 positions that president can appoint. But the tradition is that the majority of these appointments are occupied by civil servants. But one thing that characterized the Bolsonaro's administration was the militarization of the civilian roles. So more than 6,000 military personnel to civilian posts, and many without the necessary expertise, just loyalty. So you can imagine with this how much of the expertise and how much of the technical and efficiency we lost with these tactics. The second one is the intimidation tactics, use of disciplinary procedures to silence or intimidate bureaucrats. Because in Brazil, bureaucrats have tenured after 2 or 3 years in services. So we, because I am a civil servant as well, we have a lot of protections. But one way to intimidate this autonomy is to use disciplinary procedures to silence or intimidate it. So it's a kind of hardball against using the law just to persecute or to intimidate. The third one is infralegal acts, like issuing decrees and administrative measures to dismantle legal procedures without going through Congress. So this kind of strategies, because Bolsonaro didn't well with the Congress, because he was not able to form coalitions to government, and all of these kind of measures that was very, how can I say, controversial, he avoided go to the Congress, but he did it with infralegal orders. Like, I think that is the same as executive orders that Trump is doing now. So using this, it's a way to attack some agencies like environmental protector agencies and the agencies that protecting indigenous territories. So this way of trying to move or to change things with decreased normative actions and so on. The fourth tactic is the capacity erosion. So budget cuts to reduce the administrative capacities of some agents, especially agents responsible to conduct the agenda that the far right in Brazil are against. So minorities, environmental, education, special education, universities. So cutting budgets is a way to dismantle this technical and administrative capacity. And finally, he proposed a constitutional amendment in 2020 based on the efficiency, like we can see now, efficiency and the fiscal reasons. But the main objective of this measure is to altering employment regime, especially the tenure that, as you know, I don't know if you know this, that you have protection in the constitutions. In the constitution in Brazil, the rights and the civil service are protected in constitution. So he proposed this constitutional amendment. It didn't pass, but it's a kind of legacy that the current government needs to deal today. The second question is about how does the executive use captured bureaucracy to undermine democracy. So I can point out 4 tactics, 4 strategies. The first one is mission drift, altering and subverting the missions of public agents, and I can cite 2 examples. The first one is to transform the agents responsible for indigenous rights in a kind of national security against foreign influence. So, and trying to convert people with evangelical doctrines, something like that. So he used agents that exist and tried to subvert this mission. And you can see another example is that you have an agents responsible for affirmative actions or to fight against racism, but he put on the charge of these agents someone that denied racism in Brazil. So that's a kind of very subtle to promote this kind of mission drift. The second is discrediting expertise, neglecting the technical expertise essential to the effectiveness of public policies. So he attacked the National Bureau of Public Statistics because the Bureau released some data that was against the official discourse. So he discredited a lot of agents that, for example, that conduct the national exams for students enter in the college. And he said that it's an ideological agenda. So let's try to move and transform all of these tests because people that are hired, that are inside these agents, they don't have this the expertise. So discrediting this expertise. And finally, weakening participatory democracy. So civil society was excluded from formal spaces of policymaking. Only just a few that had some law enforcement that could be preserved, especially when people went to the courts against these measures. But this strategy to weakening participatory democracy was used a lot. It was from the first time of his mandate. The third question is how can career bureaucrats contain this process? So that's a very complicated issue because as nobody likes bureaucracy and nobody, even the left and the right, so in the center, so the word bureaucracy, it's related to the bad things associated to red tape. But one strategy was legalism, rely on legal procedures. So that was, in the past, was considered a managerial problem, that the government is so slow that it proved in the situation very good to contain bad decisions and using internal rules and protocols to delay or block illegal or some controversial orders. The second, voice and mobilization of external oversight. So civil servants filed complaints with the public prosecutor's office, reversals of executive actions by courts, and using all of the oversight system in Brazil that is very strong. So some public servants used it, and voice, especially by whistleblowing, and using the media and so on. So that's one strategy. The discrete resistance is like some authors call it guerrilla government. So trying to operate in the shadows, using strategies like quiet sabotage, internal obstruction. So trying to resist using this, but it's very dangerous because it's against some ethical procedures, but as a lot of bureaucrats has discretionary space, so they use this kind of resistance tactics. So, and then finally, coalition building and network, especially with civil society, international organizations, and even subnational governments to defend programs. So as Brazil's federative system, some programs are implemented by subnational governments. Bureaucrats created like networks with civil society, international organizations, and subnational governments to defend some programs. And it proved very effective in some cases. So that's a very good example. But finally, the fourth question is what are the key examples of success and mistakes to be avoided? So, as I said, what worked? strategic legalism, visibility, voice, and international support. I think that is a good strategy. Second, partnerships, especially among civil society and international organizations. And finally, the institutional oversight. As we saw yesterday by the Minister Barroso speech, the courts and judiciary was a good ally of the rule of law and all of the legal procedures. So these three things I think that worked well. But what to avoid? Isolated resistance, so resistance without collective strategies, it doesn't work, or it works just for a little time. Bureaucrats who act alone without institutional protection or coordination were exposed to retaliation, and it caused a lot of stress for people depressed, people that burn out, and this kind of freezing that Kate mentioned. The second thing to avoid is uncoordinated mass exit, because you had an agency that a lot of people resigned to their posts. So it's good for the government. So they substitute all of them with their people. But with no voice and with no strategy, exit didn't work well. Excessive legalism or over-reliance on bureaucratic procedures, it has a short time live. It doesn't work for so long because, as I mentioned, it does not work well because you are delaying and like this kind of guerrilla government. But what I think that was a great learning is that it's a relation process that each actor learn with each other. So, for example, I can say that the second term of Trump's administration learned a lot of the first one. That's why the first act was the creation of DOGE and trying to dismantle the bureaucracy. So, and we could see this in this process, that even both bureaucratic and politicians, they learn with each other and they change the strategies. And we don't know if the far right come to power again in Brazil, what will be the strategy. Maybe trying to emulate what is going on here. And my final thoughts, it's that very provocative, is that neutrality and impartiality must be redefined as when you deal with the democratic principles. Because in normal times, neutrality and expertise are the main values of the bureaucrats. But when the politicians go against constitution, legal procedure, I think that is the role of tenured bureaucrats to resist and to voice it. So it's a kind of ethos, a kind of democratic ethos, not to blindly obey the orders of the politicians. You need to obey the orders when you are in regular times, like governments that play by the rules of democratic games. But when we have this kind of darkness or this exceptional situation, we think that this kind of ethics to resist could be a rule or a role of the bureaucrats, especially that bureaucrats that are protected by the Constitution. So it's a kind of contra-majority power. So you can't think that bureaucracy could be a contra-majority power. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.
The United States today is experiencing a phenomenon almost unprecedented in the annals of political history, a phenomenon I'd call ungoverning, which is the comprehensive destruction of state capacity. It focuses on the part of government that houses capacity, the administrative state or administration. Administration is what happens after 8th grade civics ends. 8th grade civics in the United States teaches school children about how a bill becomes a law. And it also focuses on how citizens can exercise voice in informing those who write and pass laws. And it stops at that moment, once a bill becomes a law. Well, laws are just words on a page. Laws are completely inert. Laws do nothing unless there is, after the law, administration. The law has to be converted into rules that people and organizations and firms can follow or fail to follow. Those rules have to be interpreted and enforced. There have to be penalties for those rules to be followed, incentives. This is administration. And this is the only capacity that makes government capable of doing something in the world. To attack that capacity is to disable the state. Through most of political history, revolutionaries may have wanted to take over the state, but in order to use the state. They wanted to use state capacity, not destroy it. So taking over the state with the goal of destroying the state, there are precedents, and it's a pleasure to be in the company of political scientists who pay attention to countries outside of the United States and political scientists who work and live outside the United States, because you know about the relevant precedents for this phenomenon. But it is still strange. It's very strange in the United States and rare. And that's why I use a new word for what I would call, if you'll forgive me, the word, whenever you use the word new, every historian in the country attacks what you say. There's nothing new under the sun, I know that. But a new phenomenon, ungoverning. And that's the title of the book I published in the fall with Nancy Rosenblum. Ungoverning replaces the policy state, the power of policy, let's say, which is much, policy has power because of administration. So it replaces policy power, or the power of policy, with the power of personal command. The power of an uncertain, unknown, inconstant, arbitrary will of one man. That's personal power. The United States Constitution, like every constitution, was created with the goal of eliminating that kind of power and replacing it with policy power, administration. Our administrative institutions in the United States are largely creatures of the 20th century, but it's Hamilton's word, administration. And Hamilton and the United States founders, the framers of the United States Constitution, meant to create an administrative state. But that's exactly what they meant to do, because they thought that it would be more effective at serving purposes that all human beings shared, peace and prosperity. It could better protect them from foes, and it could conduce to their shared prosperity. Why ungoverning? What takes us here? Such as this is what we're witnessing. And let me just point quickly to three, let's say, causes or conditions that allow for the rise of ungoverning, allow for this different thing. One, the failure, the abdication of our national legislature, by our national legislature, of its constitutional responsibilities. I think that the Congress has about a 13% approval rating. That seems to me, it doesn't deserve that. It's abdicated its basic responsibility to pass a budget, it's invested with the power of taxing and spending. That power is not meant to be vested in the executive, but it's been ceded to the executive. Look at the tariffs. That power is explicitly vested in the legislature, ceded to the executive because of a putative emergency. The power to declare war. Did we see that when the United States, went to war for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan? Congress was silent. So a complete abdication of its formal responsibilities by a legislature. How can a legislature be a repository of be an expression of popular passions and interests if it does nothing? And that's where we are. Second, a failure of leaders in the United States to create the kind of coalition that the United States Constitution requires or insists on in order to make the United States Constitution work. You saw the election in the UK last June. I looked over somewhat with some envy. 34%, roughly, if I remember, of the popular vote elects a massive majority in Parliament that can't be stopped. There are no checks and balances, children. They can do whatever they want for 5 years. I know there's a court, it's recent, it's something, it's not nothing. But you know, it's 34% can make a government work in the UK. In the United States, of course, you need a large numeric majority to elect a majority in Congress, the House. You need a majority that's physically dispersed and geographically dispersed and temporally enduring to get a majority in the Senate, because only a third is up in any 2-year cycle. And you need to kind of combine those in an interesting way to get a majority in the Electoral College. And you have to do that probably long enough to appoint 5 justices to the Supreme Court. So that's a very large and lasting coalition that has to be built to make the United States Constitution work. Nobody's been able to do that since I was born. There have been the greatest, you know, this is sort of the lollipop, I guess. This is the apple that the Constitution holds out to those people of ambition. And I'm going to say something about ambition in a second. You know, if you can put this kind of coalition together, you become immortal. Jefferson did it, Jackson did it, FDR did it. Some might argue that Lincoln did it. That's a more complicated claim. But no one since FDR has been able to build a large and lasting coalition that can make the Constitution work. And in the absence of that, I think, you know, there's a great deal of kind of institutional pessimism among certainly my students and lots of people that we can't make, this government can't work. And so that opens the way to the possibility of, you know, rule by decree. One person who in the executive order is the exemplar of this kind of decree. I say this, let it be done. And so that's an opening to ungoverning. Finally, the last thing is this, there's a certain kind of, the administrative state, it has all sorts of interesting sources of vulnerability. You mentioned, Susan, its invisibility. And I'd also say, you know, it's kind of invisible and illegible. So people don't know what it is, where it is. Like, who decides how many disabled spaces, car spaces there have to be in a parking lot outside Home Depot? It's not the local government. And so there is a thing deciding that. You have to have X number of spaces per whatever, square foot or something, I don't know what. There's a rule, but no one knows where that rule is made, how it's made. And you know, notice and comment rulemaking is the source of that interpretation of the Americans with Disability Act. Well, so one of the features of the vulnerability, one particularly potent source of the vulnerability of the administrative state at this moment is found in its age. Many, if not most, of the administrative institutions, especially the independent agencies, so to speak, in the United States government were created in the New Deal era, roughly between, say, 36 and 48. And the generation that created those institutions has passed from the scene. And that means that the task that falls to us, to our generation, to your generation, I'm looking at students here, fellow professors. The task that falls to this generation is, you might say, mere maintenance, just keeping this thing going that was started by someone else. And there's more glory that comes to the founder than that comes to the maintainer. Maintaining is just not a very inspiring task. In 1838, the young Abraham Lincoln, he'd never given a public speech before, walks into the Lyceum, a new kind of the organization meant to spread knowledge and give people a place to meet and talk to each other in Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, dusty streets, no cobblestones, frontier, this totally obscure, self-educated person who crawled out of the woods of Kentucky and wanted to make a name for himself, stands up and makes a speech in 1838 about the perpetuation of our political institutions. And the young Abraham, the first speech he ever gives, the young Abraham Lincoln notes that the founding generation that created the United States Constitution and the national institutions of American politics had passed from the scene. July 4th, you could mark it at July 4th, 1826, 6, yes, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, when the day on which both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams die. And so here it is, about a decade later, that generation's gone. And Lincoln notes that it falls to us, he says, to maintain these things. But could an ambitious person, a capital A ambitious person, a super ambitious person, be satisfied just maintaining something someone else started? Could somebody like a Napoleon, an Alexandre, he says, be satisfied just treading in the steps of another, maintaining a building someone else designed and built, repointing the mortar between the bricks? The field of glory was harvested by the founders, and there's nothing left for us, Lincoln says. And this is the predicament. This is the predicament of those who come later. They seem to be smaller. And this is an opportunity. It's a danger. It's a hazard, he says. Someone of vaulting ambition is going to only be able to make their name by destroying what they've inherited. That's how to make a name. That would gratify great ambition. And he says, do you think someone of great ambition will never again rise up among us? They will. And this is the worry. This is the hazard. And I just offer this in closing. The solution, I think, if you think, well, maintain the status quo, do your job, be virtuous, be anonymous, don't be, we'll have to exile these great, hugely ambitious people somehow to maintain the administrative state or the institutions we've inherited, or destroy them. There's a third alternative that was being discovered just as Lincoln was giving the speech, and that's reform. And so what I think needs to happen in order to, I would say, if you don't mind my slight exaggeration, save democracy in America, is to revive and rethink and re-inspire a spirit of reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is wonderful to be here. Hungary, my home country, was mentioned practically in all panels in the previous two days, and I think it's just great to make a few comments from a Hungarian. Actually, it's a little bit misleading to be called a professor, which I'm not, and that I am working at a research institute, the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, because I'm actually an activist. I started 30-something years ago, together with Viktor Orbán. We were establishing Fidesz youth organization, a liberal youth group back then. And we went together at the first free elections in Hungary to parliament. So I started my adulthood basically being a member of parliament in Hungary. But I left Fidesz by the mid-90s. So the party formulated itself under the leadership of Orbán towards a radical organization. So I didn't find my place there any longer. And it was not just me, actually. It was a big outflow from Fidesz. So it went through a big crisis back then. Anyway, I went to the Council of Europe. I was working on democracy for 20 years until I went back to Hungarian politics. And I was again a member of parliament until 2018, opposing Orbán's system. And all my experiences working or not working together with political parties, civil society organizations, administrators. I put it in my book, which also tells those wonderful ideologies, ideas, and the playbook of Orbánism, the perfect playbook of new autocratization in the heart of the European Union, but also the struggles the various actors on the other side have been doing, because actually there is a lot of resistance in Hungary, though this is not very visible, because the bar in Hungary of the success criteria is only one: who can defeat Orbán. And we couldn't manage this for 15 years. But it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of things happening in the country. And of course, I'm very happy to talk a little bit about. And other things I'd like to comment on, and some speakers mentioned this yesterday, that there is an ideology behind Orbanism or the new autocracy. Fidesz government, Orban's government, calls it another type of democracy. So actually what we see autocracy, they call it democracy. And it goes through. A lot of people believe they are living in a democracy because there are elections. Whether they are fair or free, that's shaky. Definitely not fair in Hungary. And I would say it's not also not very free, but there are elections and people can, and the electoral autocracies perfectly make their job. So no problem happens on election day. Everything happens before, right? So the other type of democracy is actually a concept which was described in the 1920s by Carl Schmitt. It is a focus of the state, which is the power, the state power is based on elections. So elections are the crucial element of this, but nothing else. It's an anti-liberal government concept where there's no one is needed, no civil society is needed, no professional organizations, because the leaders, the state leader actually embodied by one strong man is basically authorized to lead the country, the state, of his or her own will, even to change the rules in order to make this government successful. They also consider politics as a constant war. Politics is a war. There are friends and enemies. They are us and them. And this is the only context. And of course, this is very important for public administration, as it was said. So, and everyone who is working for the state or within the state environment have to serve the state and defend the interest of the state, whatever this means. It's embodied by the leader. So in 2019, there was Hungary celebrated actually the judiciary, the 150 years of the law, which back then introduced the independence of judiciary. And the Speaker of the House, obviously representing Orbán's party, he said, 150 years ago, the question was whether the Hungarian state wanted to ensure the independence of the judiciary. Looking to the future, the question is whether, for their part, Hungarian judges wish to ensure the independence of the state. So 9 years after Orbán took the big power in 2010, they openly questioned whether independence of judges, secure and sacred basis of the judiciary is existing any longer or not. And in this concept of the Schmittian concept, it does not exist. So obviously this is really very, very relevant for public administrators, which is the topic of our panel here, which again, I am not, but I've been working as a politician in the last years, oftentimes with practically all actors within the state, civil society, and all kinds of other actors. And the problem with the public administration, as it was mentioned by my colleagues here, is that they look themselves as neutrals, as independent. They are serving the people, right? Following the law. They make it life to the law. But they cannot do this because they are operating in a completely political environment when they are not allowed to be independent. It's just a non-existing issue in Hungary. And we, all Hungarians, we know it very well. You always have to take a side. There's no in-between. In between, there are the useless, the unsuccessful, the losers, the bad. So you are under good and with us, or you are an enemy, even if you want to be neutral. So neutral is also enemy. So we are labeled by the ruling elite. And this is an incredible problem for the public administration, who find really among difficulties how to behave. And of course, many of them existed. And many of them were basically released right at the very beginning of Orbán to power, which was in 2010. And the whole governing the new takeover, a revolutionary takeover, started with capturing some key state institutions, and of course, basically decapitalizing the public administrations, putting a lot of people on pension. For example, also not just in a public administration, which the government could do with relatively easy, but also in the judiciary, they made a law and set the age limit for judges 65. So hundreds and hundreds very well experienced judges had to go to retirement. Actually, later they won a case at the European Court. 2 years later, they all got back their status. But by the time their spaces were all filled, and they were basically paid for some compensation. So the going through the judiciary processes is not always helpful. Actually, in most cases, it doesn't really change the new status quo. So public administrators do not want to do politics, but they have to, and they can even become a target of smear campaign, which is also an issue in Hungary. So recently, when in big speeches, Orbán is listing the enemies, that there are also not only independent journalists and not only civil society organizations and obviously opposition politicians, but judges are named, and public administrators, if they turn to be critics, which is also happening, then they become enemies right away. So what actually can be done in this circumstance? So fortunately, there are still a lot of, after 15 years of complete capture, I didn't say that yet, but it was told, most of you know, that the Hungarian system is so dire because Viktor Orbán's party has a supermajority, a constitutional majority. So they don't have to use any violence or a kind of tough way of assertion. They can actually change the law all the time. I think one of the most explicit example how big strength it is, not just that they changed the constitution in 2011 by one party, they already amended it 11 times or 15 times, and the election rules are basically changed before every election. So it always changed according to how it's necessary. So what the public administrators can do? Well, they can always find alliances among themselves. They can leak information. They can put things public in a way that they don't necessarily have to come to the public. If they resign, they do it very publicly. They take their cases for international fora, and often, at least they inform the wider public about what is happening, so people understand the profile of the regime, because of course a lot of people believe this is democracy, because this is how it's formulated and framed. So I would like to say a couple of words, not only about the public administrators, because of course there is administration, but eventually there are people. So it's all us in a situation we are all in. It's basically about us. How do we behave? What we do, and with whom do we collaborate? So basically, what I would say, such a system, an autocratization, is just getting worse. So there's no time for waiting. The sooner, the better. Whatever action we are planning, never act alone. As you said, being alone is a really vulnerable position. So, and of course, we are all very lonely in these systems. So always have to look for allies. It's far beyond family. It's about professional organization. It's about friend. So make new networks, new ones, the ones that you don't have yet. So build structures, new structures, even if it's informal structure. If you are civil society, act strategically, not just by chance, because you have limited resources. So you have to focus your resources, and you have to build alliances with others. So because no one has enough resources, especially in illiberal systems where civil society is specifically pressurized by refraining financial resources. Coordinate smartly. Politicians. Well, politicians are really very important. I mean, we are seeing in Serbia fascinating mass protest of hundreds of cities all across Serbia. And it's completely isolated from politics. It's all civil society. And what happens? Nothing happens. They cannot just do anything by themselves. If there is not a political alternative that is able to put things into political practice, and don't forget, you are acting in a fully political environment, then this is something to cooperate. We have to cooperate and collaborate with politicians, whether you like it or not. Try to figure out how, smartly, in different ways than before, because alternative is the one. And I think it's also very important here, it's not enough to say it's not good, right? People do not like losers in politics. They actually hate them because they say they were just tricked by the losers. So people like politicians to win. So to win, you have to attract and provide a good alternative. And this requires a lot of thinking. And this is why I'm calling academics to go much beyond their comfort zone. You have to tell your findings, your understanding of the world, a deeper processes in an understandable language to politicians, to civil society organizations. Share it with think tanks and political thinkers, because new narratives are necessary. New visions are necessary. Politicians are not good enough to figure this out. They have other jobs. They stand on a stage and they talk to people. So some other people have to think for them. But this, because no one can do anything on their own. We have to do it all together, and all of us have something role. So I'd like to conclude with something which is a guideline for my life and for many Hungarians. It's a saying, a very smart Hungarian public thinker, István Bibó, who lived 2 world wars and a 1956 revolution, who said, then democrat is someone who is not afraid. So please don't be afraid. Thank you very much.